Thanks for coming today. We're going to get started here with the Guns Tea. Today we're joined by Valerie Luzadis. She's a professor of ecological economics and policy and chair of the Department of Environmental Studies at the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry. Her research and teaching focuses on the relationships among social, economic, and ecological systems. Luzadis' current focus is on systems approaches to social ecological foundations for conservation and sustainability, and her scholarly work includes a focus on the practice of interdisciplinary science and efforts to collaboratively link science and policy. Valerie is currently president of the United States Society for Ecological Economics, having served as leader of the founding organizational committee in 1999 and on the board 3 times in varying capacities since then. So we're going to hear today about ecological economic leadership. We're all really glad you're here, so welcome, Valerie.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for coming today, especially when it's finally getting a little bit warm and the sun is out. That's a lot to work against, actually, as I well know coming from Syracuse.
It's better than a blizzard.
That's right. So actually, what I'm hoping today is that we will talk about ecological economic leadership. And what I plan to do is to share a few ideas that I have about what we need to think about and focus on from where I sit. But I'd like to, and I plan only to have comments for probably about 30 minutes at most, and then have a conversation for talking about some of these things. So the announcement of my talk had a different title than this. I don't even remember what that was right now. I can tell you it's in here somewhere because it's in my line of thinking. But when I was thinking about how to frame what I wanted to say today, what started happening is I was thinking a lot about what are a couple of things that really matter to me and where I've put my attention in my career. And one of them is on leadership development. And so I've done a tremendous amount with leadership development, leadership training, and it occurred to me that the issues that I was recognizing in ecological economics actually probably really need some leadership in a way that I'm not sure, have effectively been able to achieve yet. So that's the framing of what I wanted to talk about today, is thinking about this in terms of leadership. So I'm thinking about ecological economics. I'm not talking about the U.S. Society for Ecological Economics. I'm talking about ecological economics more broadly, and I'll invite it anything you want that to be. And we can talk a little bit about that later because that may come into play. So in terms of sort of basic leadership ideas, I think I just drew on some of these things that you think about in order to be a good leader as an individual. There are many of these things that actually have insights for us to think about as if we want ecological economics to be more in the leadership role, or at least engaged in the conversations that are happening nationally and internationally, what do we need to do? So bringing the two together, these first bullet points are some ideas about what is it that good leaders reflect. Well, they reflect some level of shared values. They often inspire some sort of shared vision, and that can be narrow or it can be broad. It doesn't have to be a tiny little thing. There's some idea that there's working for a greater good, so it's not a personal gain kind of idea. Trust, confidence, and the last one I decided to bold, and that's results. And that's because that is something that actually we were talking about earlier, and it is a part of what I've had in here for today, so I think this will be important. And then for those of you who are involved with the leadership world and know of Jim Collins, of course you know the big, hairy, audacious goals idea. And so I have expanded that beyond big, hairy, audacious goals to be also ideas and questions in particular. And I'm thinking a lot about this in terms of the science that we do in ecological economics, and so thinking about it both in terms of what are the big questions, and are we focusing in the places where we actually can make some change and make some big difference, and are we results oriented? Are we thinking about getting data, getting some sort of outcome of this that actually can help in terms of changing the world? So I never look at my notes, so periodically I have to put my head down and take a look and see if I've said what I want to. Well, so now, as I said, I was not going to limit this to just talking about the U.S. Society for Ecological Economics, and I will not. However, I will next present something that the U.S. Society did do in an effort to begin thinking about how we understand ourselves, how do we move off the dime of having this wholly internal conversation about should we allow this or allow that, and what seemed to be a bunch of pointless questions that we could spend our lives talking about and not get anywhere. So the new board of directors met a year ago and did a futuring exercise. And one of the outcomes of that was to essentially make this first statement, which was, we called it a premise, but I separated it into a premise and goals. And this was to finally, just as an organization, make a statement to say, the premise of our gathering together is that the current economic system isn't working. And we were, while we've had the feedback that that's all ecological economics has done is just yell about what isn't right, the reality is, this gave us an opportunity to just make a statement and move on. Make a statement and say, okay, so now what? And so taking that statement and saying, okay, here's our premise is it's not working the way it is, so what do we need to do? So we set a couple of goals, and one is to develop new approaches to understanding our economy and its dependence on biophysical systems that govern life. So that's a very large tent, big tent kind of idea. And then the second one is really create, debate, and promote new paradigms, tools, and messages to facilitate in that. So it's much more specific as well, that would help us to move toward justice and sustainability, and at multiple scales. So this was the opening statement. And this is the kind of conversation where I think it's a useful thing to step into the next step. And I called this, in this case, these big, hairy, audacious goals. Well, they are sort of that, I would say. We weren't using this framing when we put this together, but I think it's worth thinking about. And the questions that we put together, we did present here in June, and I will share them with you here. I'm not sure how big these are or how hairy or audacious they are, but they're a start. And the point is that we wanted to get off the edge of things and start saying there are lots of issues that we need to pay attention to, and these are some of them. So I'll quickly share these questions and then move on to a whole bunch of other ideas that I've added since then that are just mine alone. This is from the board of the Society for Ecological Economics. So the first one is really just asking the question of what is the role of markets? And so the thing that you will see about these questions is they tend to be scaled out. So not just what role can markets play, but what is the role of markets in a just and sustainable society? But also what changes are needed to our economic system to allow us to solve these problems that we have. What changes, so we have unemployment and poverty specifically listed as separate questions. And then what is it, how do we learn about these biophysical limits as we understand them before we cross them? What is it that we need to know about that? And that how do we adapt our systems to deal with these, especially in light of uncertainties? So these are just the big ideas. Two more groups of questions here. Understanding our place, and this one was very much of understanding our value system. How do we understand ourselves from a cosmological perspective of who we are and how we fit in the universe? But all the way to the details of size of population and carrying capacity and how do we do this? There are many questions to deal with in that respect. And as we're talking about that, what kinds of tools do we have to talk about this? And I would say added to this is what knowledge do we have about this and what knowledge do we need to add to this to have a conversation that will be fruitful? And the last one is what is the relationship between local movements and foundational changes? That actually seems very relevant here given the activities of the GUND and the activities here with a lot of the local community connections and work that's happening. But then I think this last one is interesting, difference between reform and revolution. I should say, and I see there's a videotape on, I'll say this anyway. I was really, really happy to see the word revolution in this at all. It could be in a different place in all of this, because I do think in some ways there is a radical rethinking that we need to do. And get back to that issue of results, we need to think about results. So, a few other questions to come up with, that I've come up with, that I've added to this. So one of them in my own mind is this idea of, we've talked a lot about ecosystem services and valuation. I think valuation is very often understood as, and heard as, monetization. I think there is a distinction between those two things. And quantification is yet another something, and all three of these things matter. And so we want to make sure that we're having the conversation appropriately. But I'm particularly interested in the second point of finding a way to have the conversation such that we're not just talking about having supply meet demand, but we're actually talking about the demand. So that it becomes a dialogue, we're not just putting prices on things to be, that if we're going to deal in this world of monetization, that we're not just putting prices on things to be supplied. That it becomes a conversation about what some of the other questions are. What are the limits? Where are we in this? What are the values, and how does our societal organization reflect that set of values? And are we actually engaging in a way that does reflect that? Okay, a bunch of non sequitur ideas here. Here's the next one. So one of the big ideas we were talking about is this connection between social and biophysical, and then I added to this science and policy issues. And I think one of the things that we have not effectively yet grappled with is the issue of rigor. That one of the critiques that I hear, I don't see it a lot. I guess we see it actually in responses and reviews of papers, but we don't see it in print yet. A lot of the conversation about, oh, it's not rigorous enough. And so when you truly integrate and truly do interdisciplinary studies, what does it mean to be rigorous? What are the right tests for that? Can we think of it in the same way we have always thought about that, or not? And if not, then how? And how do we communicate that? Because it matters, of course, that we have some idea that what we're doing is not just some random finding, and that it has the the collective confidence behind it, that we can say something about it. So how do we understand what that collective confidence is when we're dealing with complexity and complex systems? Another question. It seems to me that national security is a gigantic driver of what we do in terms of decision making. And we don't have a lot of conversation about that right now in ecological economics. If you look at the national security world and its connection to natural resources, that's really clear. Resources are the foundation for many wars and concerns about, will we have enough of whatever it is we think we need to live? But if you look at it in terms of national security related to economics, the entire dialogue is about economic growth as the foundation for maintaining security. And since we're in some ways in ecological economics in the business of asking the question of is there another way or other ways to understand that, that's not in this dialogue with national security at all. And this really prompted me to start thinking about this whole topic of leadership, is how do we collectively, and now way beyond US society, this is just ecological economics in its broadest sense, we need to be in that conversation. How do we do that? How do we get there? And I think these are the kinds of things we should be grappling with. So what do we need to learn? What kind of evidence do we need to bring to the table to be heard, to be in that conversation in the first place, and be part of that? Because right now, we are a fringe element. And it seems to me that these are really important issues, and these big, important issues that I think will drive a lot of our decision making, we're not at the table. And it seems to me that that's something we should take a look at and think about. Here are a few other ones. In the education world, how do we deal with this issue of depth versus breadth? So is it that we now, if we're dealing with disciplinary issues, do you have to have a full rendering of everything in each one in order to be considered an expert, and then you can be in the room, and now you also somehow in there have to learn how to be a collaborator and a communicator and a facilitator and a synthesizer and I could go on and on. Or should it be that, okay, you're a phenomenal facilitator and you can synthesize really well, but you don't really know anything, or that's what the impression is, about anything else with depth. These are extremes, obviously. So where is that? And that's a tension that we're always talking about in terms of higher ed. And by virtue of the topics that we're dealing with ecological economics, those questions are at hand. And so that's a thread of conversation, and it's something that can be studied. We can look at this, and we could do some ideas. We could get an idea about who is valued in a room and why. I think it's possible to look at these things. We just aren't right now. Diversity and sustainability. There's not a lot of conversation about that. So we talk a lot about poverty, and we talk a lot about equity, and we talk a lot about these issues, but right now, the sustainability message is not one that's of great concern, at least in the United States, of great concern outside of a set of people who look a lot like us. And so this is something that, again, there's opportunity for discussion about that, there's opportunity for study about this, and so it really raises the question of the relationship between the issues about how we want to organize to sustain life and enhance its quality, and I'll credit Tufts for that definition. That's the definition of economics that they use in their micro and macroeconomics in context books. And it's my favorite definition of economics.
Say it again.
It's how we organize ourselves to sustain life and enhance its quality. Very different definition than the efficient allocation of scarce resources. So when you say efficient allocation of scarce resources, we're suddenly right down here. And we've already accepted the value of efficiency. Haven't even had a conversation. But when you frame it as how do we organize ourselves to sustain life and enhance its quality, we suddenly have a much broader conversation and can get down to, okay, what does that mean for us? So phenomenal work, never good women.
And you said that that was
Tufts, they're micro and macro economics and context textbooks that are introductory textbooks, fabulous. Good
Okay.
books to work from. And then this last one is something that I've been thinking about, and I thought, oh, I'll throw it out. If any place there might have some traction at UVM, probably not so much even in the ESO, I don't know. This is my impression of you all. So now you got something to live up to here. But my thought is this idea of, I think too often things are framed and understood in terms of dualities. And I don't have a lot to articulate about this, but I have this very strong feeling that what we're talking about when we're talking about how we organize to sustain life and enhance its quality is that it's a much more comprehensive thing than what we tend to think about economy versus environment and these dualisms that actually are relatively unproductive. And we certainly know all about those, and anybody who's followed Norgaard's work, the two maladaptive determinisms of social and environmental determinism, as also maladaptive in the sense that how productive can this be? And so I think there's actually a fair amount of interesting philosophical work that could be, that could enhance our understanding and thinking about these things. All right, so now I'm shifting to, I say, ideas here. And this is something where these are, so again, big, hairy, audacious ideas. And this one is that scarcity is the wrong focus. Marginal thinking, so these two ideas here, economic thinking is too limiting. Marginal thinking, and when I say marginal thinking, I'm really talking about marginal utility, the measurements of the next one, whatever it is. I'm not suggesting that we throw those things away. I'm suggesting those are phenomenal tools that have absolutely captured our attention, and it's like a magician has done whatever they do and said, wow, and our attention is completely captured by this in such a way in economics that we have failed to look beyond this as an idea about how to think about things. I'm going to come back to some of these ideas and drop in the scarcity idea. And this is to say that these things I put in the category of ideas because it's really about how we think about the world, frames things in such a way, or can frame things in a way that it allows us to consider new alternatives more than some others might allow us to think of new alternatives. And I think this quote from Scarcity, this is from a book that's just come out last year by Melanchthon and Shafir. It's a behavioral economist and environmental psychologist who put this, the book is called Scarcity. There's a subtitle, I can't remember what it is right now. But essentially, this is something that they say I think is absolutely worth our considering, which is that scarcity is not just a physical constraint. It's a mindset. And that when it captures our attention, the scarcity, it changes how we think. And so we neglect other things and we become less effective. And I would argue, as going forward here, that it causes us to put our attention to some things more than others. Hold that thought. I'm going to come back up to the first point here and add in a few things. It's not just scarcity thinking. It's partly this glamour of the power of marginal utility and the power of marginal analysis. It is incredibly powerful, and it's fabulous when it's appropriately applied. We have come to use it as a tool for lots of things there where it might not be appropriately applied. So this is the point. The language of exchange, if any of you haven't read David Graeber's book on debt, The First 5,000 Years, great read. And he was involved with the Occupy Wall Street movement and came up with this sort of 1%, 99%, 1% idea. And he talks about this, and I think it's a phenomenal idea, that this language of exchange, if you think about it, it's pervasive throughout our interactions with each other. And we have actually come to understand our relationships with each other very much in terms of what we owe and what we are owed. We certainly have that in an academic setting. You know, you owe me that paper, or where's my grade? You didn't get this graded yet, or whatever it is. But I mean, we do a lot of this. We reflect this very much. But one of the things it does is it relieves us from having to feel any sense of responsibility for each other. And so there's a lack of, we are no longer required to care. All we have to do is fill out the accounting sheet. So this goes along with, so the idea here is that the way in which we speak, the ideas that frame how we're thinking about things, then come out in terms of our interactions and relationships with each other. And that leads to this other bullet point, which was previously my title, which is about the consumer-citizen tension. And that idea of this sort of me-we interplay, and we talk about this a lot, is we're so focused on individual, but that's what marginal thinking is. That's what we tend to play up the market and democracy connection, one person, one vote. It doesn't matter whether that vote is pulling a lever, or writing a name, or handing somebody $1. And so I would argue there are some pretty big distinctions among those things. And so this tension about consumers and citizens, we live in a world that focuses on consumer first. And we put that front and center in terms of the way in which we describe ourselves, understand ourselves, and in fact, we were given that as our first answer to 9/11, was that, the most important thing you can do in response to this is what? Go something, right? Buy stuff, be a consumer. Not be a citizen, and stand up for values that matter. It was about consumption. It was about being a consumer. And we more and more and more, if you look at the language, you look at our behaviors, we really do tend to fall into this category, thinking of ourselves as consumers first. And then somewhere in there, there's citizens. So as I said, I had this front and center. Here's another impression I had. I thought, I'm going to Vermont. I don't need to put that front and center. Vermont, so you guys have this stuff all over the place where there's a lot more reflection of citizenship here than there is where I am, for instance, and other places around the world. And so I'm guessing you understand this idea pretty well, because I see action at the local level that very much reflects that idea. And I love it, and I think it's something we have to hang on to and do more of and replicate as much as possible. Bringing us back around to the scarcity idea. So my suggestion is that in economics we have to stop really focusing on scarcity. And I say focus, and I mean focus. So when we focus on that, we're focusing on what we don't want. Obviously, scarcity isn't what we're after. But we know that what we put our attention to is what we get. And so there is all sorts of evidence for that in the scientific literature in all different places. I mean, even, whether it's from exercise physiology, that when you're working this muscle group, if you pay attention to it, you'll get better results than if you don't. And so that attention, it seems to me, is a completely appropriate analogy to say, all right, if we're focused on what we don't have, and about fear of losing it, or not having enough of it, that's what we create. Whereas if we focus the central part of our attention on what we do want, we would be in a much better position to actually create it. So this doesn't mean we don't pay attention to limits. It doesn't mean we don't pay attention to the evidence we have before us for the problems that challenge us. It just means it moves out of the central part of our vision to a separate place where it's one of the things influencing how we can achieve potentially what it is we want. But in ecological economics, we have not been very good at articulating what that is. Been great at saying what the problems are. That's the easy part, right? That's the first and most, and you know, everybody can critique. And, well, we should. I'm not going to argue with that. But critique alone isn't enough. And the question of, so what? What is it that we're after? And so to follow this line of thinking and the idea of the power of intention and attention, we really need to have the conversations about what are these possible alternative futures, and I would put that with an S, that are what we want. What are the many ways that we might be able to understand those? And that will be a better idea, even if they can be fuzzy, they can be abstract art, they can be interpretive dance, they can be, you know, but I think there are many ways in which we could express that, but it's the attention to that that matters in this. So, what does this mean for ecological economic leadership? Well, that's actually a question I'm sort of going to pose to the group as sort of the final thing. I do think this whole area of how we could do, what we put our attention to in terms of the science of ecological economics, is that we have to ask big questions. And I think big, hairy, audacious questions are good ones to ask. But we need to get something, we have to have results. I mean, what the point of science is to create new knowledge. And the point of having good questions is that it's knowledge that then is valuable to us. And so I think that's the idea, is that it's not just a critique, we have to have the entire piece. I'm saying this in an academic institution, of course you know that. But I think when we think about the broader sense of ecological economics, it's interesting that a lot of times it's the front end of the conversation we're having and not the rest of it. And so I think we could put more attention to, all right, what do we know, what do we need to know that will help make these arguments, that we see and understand that there are things in the world we would like to have changed. What now? What do we need to know to help do that? So in terms of leadership, bringing it back around to the front, to the beginning question. What is it that we can do? How can we have more of an impact? How can we be in the right rooms for conversations at all scales, not just local level? I think we're doing a pretty good job in many places at local level, making some impact. We're scaling up in some places like here, which is really exciting. Had the conversation yesterday with John Erickson about GPI application in New York State, and we both just laughed. And thought that's a little bit away from the realm of what we see as feasible right now, if only because of the size and scope of the New York State government, the influence of New York City and the financial markets. And so there's a little bit more work of other sorts to be done probably before that is a real viable step forward, although the conversation could be started. So thinking about that in terms of collaborations, who else needs to be in the room? And this is now coming back to a little bit thinking about us as a group of people who study these things. Who do we associate with? Who do we understand as being part of that? And I put a list of sort of some collaboration ideas. And I preceded it with an idea that I guess I should explain a little bit. Approaches that build beyond competition. Happily, UVM is now moving ahead with one of these as a collaboration with other institutions to do this. Not publicly announcing anything. And
Tapes rolling.
I think all of us have had great relationships with each other as collaborators in terms of scientists, but I think we're now also needing to look at institutionally, how do we operate across institutional boundaries in a way that gets us answering the right questions in the most effective ways, and I'm thinking even possibly there are big restructurings of higher ed that are probably in our future, and this is something we should be considering. Is that idea of getting away from a competitive model of education to a collaborative model for answering these questions that we need everybody on. It's not about a competition and that, you know what, you're gonna get the best question and that means for me. The reality is whatever questions every one of us, we all are asking are all important. We need them to be important, first of all, and we all need to be doing this work. So I'm gonna stop there and open it up for conversation. It's just sort of whatever you want to talk about.
I appreciate you bringing up the book Scarcity, as I've mentioned to you before. And I've been desperate for somebody else to read it. So if anyone, I want to talk about it. So the book's called Scarcity. Let's talk about it. Book group. I wanted to throw this out there because I think I'm in your boat with the scarcity idea that because we're so focused on it, it may be limiting us, and that we should be focusing on what we want. We don't want scarcity. We want something else. When I've talked about that, though, I've received pushback from folks in the ecological economics discipline that say, no, we haven't focused enough on scarcity. The point is things are much more scarce than we think, so we need to focus more on scarcity. And you know, I think that's part of my critique of ecological economics is that actually hasn't been a bridge builder or something that's rallied enough people to give us that opportunity to be leaders or to get into the leadership conversations. So I wanted your response or the group's response to that idea.
Well, I'll ask about another book. Have you read Eco-Mind by Frances Moore Lampay? She wrote Diet for a Small Planet many years ago. It's an interesting take for an old hippie environmentalist, an interesting take on our conversation about it. And she really hits on these ideas of how we turn people off when we talk about scarcity, or we turn people off when we have the conversation in a way that they don't want to talk about this. And I think that's part of the scarcity issue is it goes along with fear-mongering that we've seen in our political realm and that we know for 500 years is pretty Machiavellian, you know, roots to this idea. How we keep people in line is through fear and power over. And I think the mindset, so Melinda and Shapiro in this scarcity book really focus in on, they've done a tremendous study that their evidence is based on interacting with individuals in situations of poverty. And so they've got, it's a really great study that they found this on. My thought is that given what they're saying about the mindset and how much it captures attention and how much it keeps people from coming up with alternatives, that I actually think that's true at a macro level as well. So I think we're caught in this notion of focus to scarcity, fear of loss, marginal thinking, that it's preventing us from coming up with creative alternatives to these things in a way that if with a little bit of reflection and attention to say, oh, maybe that's happening, then maybe there can be one step out and suddenly we expand the question, the research question, or we expand the group who's in the room to have the conversation for the next collaboration. What could we be asking that might be a little bit different than this? How do we have people in that?
Can I ask a question about that? I don't know if you got your scarcity question answered, but I want to read the book.
That was great, thank you,
Okay.
yes.
So is there an example of a field or an area of thought that's undergone the kind of transition you just most recently said, like marginal thinking, scarcity, give that up, realize other possibilities? That's the revolution that could happen within economics or what we do, sustainability. Is there another one from any field anywhere that's like an inspiration that people got unhitched from this tradition and things got really better fast?
That's a good question, and maybe.
I might suggest architecture, William McDonough's work, Cradle to Cradle. It's not really a scarcity model, but it has like a similar parallel in the new thinking of upcycling and moving to this positive vision. And I think that there is increasingly a shift in architecture in general towards that type of thinking.
Yep.
And biomimicry and et cetera, that brings forward models of that. So it's a great idea.
Physics, something completely unrelated to sustainability, like just some
So
abrupt change in mindset.
quantum physics was that, right? So the shift from relativity to quantum physics is actually would be a reflection of that. And I was thinking even in a smaller scale, any wildlife biologists here? I just think about population biology and community. So I think there are some issues of those models. Now, to me, those are way easier to deal with and change than anything economic, because we don't live everyday wildlife populations and quantum physics. While we do, we don't interact with us in terms of how our choices.
Yeah.
And so I had a student once who described economics as the slow science. and I thought, and he wasn't just talking about slow to change, but he was talking about the fact that we live this every day, and it's not just a group of academics and people writing books who can come up with a better idea and then publish a new set of texts, but it's an entire system by which we live.
Yeah.
So it's a much more hairy problem.
Yeah.
than some. But the model of change is a good way to think. So if you think about what are big social changes might be a better way to think about that, or a different way that might be more useful to us. And we have made some of those, right? So we no longer allow slavery.
That's a good one.
Um,
That was improvement.
right? So there's a
At
distinction.
least in this country.
Right.
Exactly.
Which is different tax.
Just as a clarification on this, I feel like maybe I misunderstood. You're not really saying that you need a revolutionary change in the theory around scarcity. You're just saying we need a shift of attention, something a more positive. You know, you're talking about some of the psychological literature, I think, of which I agree with. I think is a good point about how, you know, if we focus on a goal, we're more likely to achieve it than if we're focusing on the constraints. Right, but that's sort of a change in it's not a criticism of all of the theory in economics or ecology or about scarcity right now.
That's right.
That all that theory is fine. We don't need a revolutionary change in the theory. We're just saying let's focus on something more positive. And my comment on that, and I agree, I think it's a really good point, important point, especially for leadership. But my comment on that is the problem that we're all living in this era of climate change. And so how can we put a positive spin on that, or sort of put that aside, let's focus on the goal? I mean, to me, I don't see how it's going to be possible.
Thanks. I'm Jillian Galfer. We haven't met. I'm a research professor here. But kind of getting to that point, I guess I had two things. And one is that a number of us in this room work on climate change in Vermont and impacts in Vermont. And what's actually gained huge traction here is really looking at climate change as an opportunity to build resilience at a community level. And even the word or the concept resilience has much more traction and empowerment with everyone, whether it's at the town level, individual level, or at the state level, than an idea like adaptation or mitigation. So to me, that's kind of moving from a dialogue of, you know, scarcity or responding or fearfulness to a what do we have and how can we make our system stronger and more resilient. So that's kind of a local example where I see that happening. But, you know, I think I also look at, say, development interventions in developing countries where they're using dried weeds to feed an aquaculture system. And really, I see development as one field where people have gone from how do we get more food to how do we produce food with what we have, or how do we make more out of the local infrastructure and resources we have. And Christine probably knows more about health and those sorts of interventions. But so it's interesting to me to see your collaboration list is all economics. And I think that reaching out to people who are doing that work in development, whether it's resilience in the United States to climate change or floods or things like that, or building rural communities that have, you know, adapted to their local conditions to use what they have, not what, you know, society tells us we want, I think is really powerful. I'm also a natural scientist, so I see that there's so much work being done on what are our planetary boundaries and how can we adapt to produce and live within those planetary boundaries. And that's where I see the most power in pairing with ecological economists, is that we can both define those planetary boundaries for a particular system, but then to have kind of the economic tie-in and the social science tie-in is really important. So I would just kind of lobby for those.
So these questions from the agenda for inquiry are exactly about that last bit that you're talking about. I appreciate the reflection on the list of institutions. When I wrote that, I was really thinking strictly about U.S. ecological economic
Sure.
society. I wasn't thinking about the broader question. But this conversation is making me think that perhaps there is place for a paper on this on the broader level, and then this would be relevant connections. And I love your examples of this, and that in some ways that answer to your question that it's a matter of how you choose. It's just like saying whether you have a research question or a hypothesis. Write it whichever way you want. But you should. I think the question is how we frame the thing in the first place. So it's not suggesting that these are not things to pay attention to. It's just suggesting that we do it within a different organization of thought, which is, I think your examples were great about that resilience and how do we become able to withstand change over time, or however you want to define that.
I think scarcity is very important, and I see an interaction between scarcity and fairness and stability. And because fairness is so tough to deal with, we don't want to mention scarcity. Some of our best times, the best generation and all that, we look backward times of scarcity, but it was scarcity that was felt broadly, not just by a segment of the population. So I think scarcity felt broadly is fine. I think it is a stimulus for a creativity. And it's kind of like football. Football is an attempt to maximize subject to some constraints. No constraints, it's not a football game, it's a riot. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. So likewise here, we're asking, when the scarcity argument comes up, we're basically asking people to do things voluntarily. And that doesn't fly. And we also know we've got a terrific difference. How do you speak to someone who has nothing? How do you handle somebody who wants all of it? So that's my take. Scarcity is absolutely important. The signals that it sends are appropriate, but they have to be sent broadly and fairly. And then I'm happy to talk about the latest new technology. But until there's a signal that says something about the consequences of that technology on the system we're worried about saving, I'm okay to go back to scarcity.
But that's exactly the point. So I'll take your point about scarcity and say back to you then, all right, then this idea of until we have some idea of how we want to use this technology, then we can talk about it. I feel like that was scarcity, that we've gotten caught. It's not the issue of scarcity itself, it's the what we do with it. It's the fact that we're focused on this as the overriding problem. In terms of, and when you think about it, yes, we have limits to things, but the rest of our problem is how do we organize to live our lives the way we want to?
Okay, fair enough. But meanwhile, where's the signal that says that it's scarce in a way that is effective and doesn't scare people about scarcity?
Yeah. Do you mind if I respond to that?
I don't mind at all.
Okay, I would just argue, the question right now is the signal is coming from the field of sustainability science, or whatever you want to call it, that there's a signal kind of coming from academia or from a small group of researchers that has maybe a rarefied insight into what's coming down the road because of sophisticated models we built or whatever. But the signal that's much stronger and clearer and resonates, kind of throughout society is the signal that Jillian's, the group that Jillian works with is responding to. It's like, okay, we had Irene, and now we know that we're having more floods, and so that's a broadly based sort of signal that's actually a biophysical signal. And so I think the signal that Val's talking about, not to put words in your mouth, is the signal we're delivering. It's like, are we saying, oh no, gloom and doom, everything's gonna be horrible? Are we kind of letting natural events unfold, and the framing that we're using is actually kind of a positivity framing and saying, what's the next phase of our society look like, and what do we really want, and what do we envision, and kind of what's the language of abundance around that? Maybe it's kind of like more social connection and deeper connection to the land or whatever. There are a lot of directions, kind of rhetorical directions that you could take it. But that signal, we don't, as academics, have the power to distribute that signal broadly and evenly to society. That's can't come from us because people aren't going to listen to that.
And let me just add one bit to that and say that there's an element here of science that matters. And so when we're thinking about what is it that we do want, it raises different questions that we might actually ask as researchers and gather evidence about that help us to have the conversation.
So maybe the problem is economics, the term economics. And why I'm saying this is the Tufts definition that you laid out. I have a diverse training in social science writ large, and I consider myself a social scientist, right? I'll beg, borrow, and steal from every discipline possible to make sense of the social phenomenon, its relationship to the natural environment. I don't care what discipline it is. But that definition that was laid out, a sociologist could easily say that that's a definition of society, right? And it's that challenge that to every problem, to every hammer, every problem is a nail, that the economic worldview really tends to go towards the monetization and financial resource flow as the ultimate resource flow that matters the most. And I know that ecological economists don't believe that, but the rest of your field does. And do we need a much more diffuse and diversified or pluralistic view of what kinds of resources we're talking about? Information flows. So we can talk about the diffusion of innovation through networks and think about where are the leverage points in a network that you can diffuse an idea that will actually be a tipping point that will change society in ways. We need to get that kind of sophistication, I think, in this. Or political capital, the flow of power that economics doesn't really, there's no theoretical basis for this. Now, certainly in ecological economics, yes, with the laws of thermodynamics and whatnot. Cultural capitals, physical and natural capital. Is natural capital even a capital?
Yeah,
or is the natural world an actor that needs the same level of respect as a human being? And or is it a commodity? So I wonder to what extent your thoughts are about just problematizing our disciplinary structure to a certain extent, and really what we need is a broader frame. Look at social science and look at the relationship between social and natural systems in this sort of renewed way.
I think you've done a phenomenal job of describing this broad area of ecological economics.
Yeah.
Because I think that's actually the whole point, is trying to find all these, drawing upon, so the whole methodological pluralism foundation of ecological economics is saying what you have just articulated very well, is that we draw upon anything to help us sort of focus on these problems. That's the problem focus approach to this. In terms of, so I don't know, what that's making me think about is the idea of the realities of funded science. So that's, funded science is a different story. It can't just be about these problems and the resolution of them on the ground. There are other elements of what new knowledge are we bringing to bear? How are we advancing our understanding of the world? And I think that both of these things can happen through a lot of what you say, but I think we narrowly construe lots of things, including our disciplines that we draw upon. And I think you're right about sociology. That's the first thing I thought when I saw the definition. But jump in, other questions. You had something I thought you were going to ask or say.
Oh, it was back to the scarcity point. I liked your point about needing to feel scarcity across society for it to actually have an impact. But I was sitting here thinking that I don't even think that's possible because of the equity issues that we're dealing with. There was a recent report that came out. Research shows that wealth and the ability to sort of transcend a potential collapse will, that you can maintain some sort of level of standard of living for much, much longer as we move sort of towards increasing scarcity than many other people. So although I agree with your point, I just don't think in such an inequitable society that that's even possible at this point.
Okay, but if we're trying to solve a problem, if that's a barrier that's insurmountable, as the Dalai Lama supposedly said, if you can't solve a problem, why worry? And I guess also
You frame the problem differently.
Exactly, that's it.
You solve it, you see another way to look at the problem, and then you start coming at solutions from a different frame.
Speak to that.
So that's the difference between framing it in scarcity and framing it
Okay,
in
let
something
me
else.
give you another, I'm grinding my own axe, but I guess I'll do that. Donella Meadows is one of the few people in there who set herself a carbon limit. Not because she couldn't afford more air flights. She just said, I've done it for this year, I'm not going to visit you even though you've asked me to come talk. Is there anyone in this room who has a carbon limit?
Yeah, and it became an issue because Quakers travel, and I said I'm not going to yearly meeting. I'm sorry,
Okay, anybody else?
but that was.
Shame is also not a good framing or tactic. Just letting you know. Throw that out there.
Okay, but look, if there's any physical reality behind this, what's wrong with talking about it?
Well, No, I'm just saying that when you look at communication strategies, scarcity and shame don't seem to rally people as much as other framings do.
Okay, so what's the one that traveling is cool and the carbon problem will take care of itself?
Right, so but that's the conversation we can have and say, so then what? But if somebody comes to this from a position of being shamed into it, I think there's less likely to have a behavioral shift. And this would be interesting to see what the behavioral economists say about
You
this.
may need shame
Yeah.
to pass a carbon tax. Once it's passed, no more shame.
But if shame causes people, triggers a denial reaction, and then people,
If they can't afford it, it doesn't matter.
well, yeah, no,
And
that's
then
true.
they'll, if they feel it among themselves, they'll work together to make life good within the constraints.
So I'm struck by the conversation around scarcity as well as trying to get more positive. What are we after? And you know, yesterday, I think it was yesterday, the day before, Michael Porter releases his social progress index, and that gets reported everywhere. Okay, massive discussion about the social progress index, which includes a whole set of environmental sustainability issues, greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity, as well as access to information and wellness. And because it's Michael Porter, it's a news story, it's credible, and it becomes genuinely pitched at, well, this is aspirational actually. What we're really after is social progress. And here are elements of social progress that didn't have anything to do with GDP. It didn't have anything to do with consumption. And a bunch of us have been playing around with GPI for years. And right? And it's kind of this fringe item. But Porter can launch a social progress index and all of a sudden it has a range that
Resonates.
and
Traction
resonates
maybe
and
in a way,
traction, and I almost feel like we're not.
Do we need big names?
You need big names,
Nodes with
right?
high degrees of centrality.
Right? I mean,
Opinion leaders.
right? I mean, he's turning something. He's making it aspirational,
Well,
and that's powerful.
It is powerful. It's a really interesting question, and you know, it'd be an interesting thing to think about. So another area of my world is higher ed administration. And it's interesting to watch college presidents or university presidents and the decisions that they make. But this is a big issue in terms of how do you bring the visibility to your institution or to your program or and what you're mentioning is exactly this sort of star power. And we live in a world of star power. And I don't mean celestial body. But do we just take advantage of that? So who can we bring into the conversation and have as a poster child for these ideas? I don't know. It's not a bad way to think about it in some ways because you want the word out. How do you do it?
Well, Joe McGinnis just wrote a book on leadership, which actually sort of gets to this issue. He's not an economist, but
That's okay.
that's okay. I wanted to tie into what sort of Chris was saying about the idea and how to create a tipping point. Because we're talking about getting away from the scarcity concept. And the opposite of the scarcity concept is growth.
Not necessarily.
So, well, you can say abundance, but it's what sort of growth does one, okay.
I don't
What do
think
you,
of it as growth.
it could
Okay.
be what do you want to grow? That could be the question. If you want to grow well-being, do you want to grow?
Exactly.
Like it can be framed that way in a way that doesn't.
Because if you
make it
look at
material.
basically, all our models are based upon growth, but it's just what sort of growth do you want to do?
Or what is growing?
What
Right. What is
And so one of the things which you referred to earlier, and we haven't brought up, is the role of markets. So basically, what is the design of the market, which is basically what is the policy which supports the design of the market, which puts, quite frankly, the limitation or the taxation of negative externalities and promotes the growth of positive externalities, which if you want to talk about it is actually getting into the quantum field, because that is where you get greater outputs based upon your inputs.
But it
So
comes back
this
also
is
to
the
Bob's
market.
idea of the policy could be set that just says, here's the base that we will use.
Well, the thing is that we have never had a market based upon restriction because of this growth concept. So that's one of the things which you know, at the ecological economics conference in the spring, you know, there were no discussions of markets, really. There were, and there really was not a discussion of growth. Everything, just as you said, much of it was the limitation, you know, talking about retracting ourselves rather than finding ways to expand.
Yeah, so this actually makes me think of some of the early framing of ecological economics, which really was about shifting our understanding of wealth from one of quantity to quality. Mm-hmm. And so when you say what is it that we're growing, you can think of it that way as well. Interesting question in terms of growth models, and if I was thinking here, if we plugged in different things that we wanted to grow, how do we have that happen? My initial reaction, I would say, is not considered a response, is that are we just using the language of exchange again and allowing ourselves to not care about each other and putting it into a market and say, well, people will care about each other as much as it's worth it in a market sense. And so just a question or thought around that, so I'm not sure.
Yeah.
So,
Well, we're nearing the
Yes,
1
that
o'clock
is 1
hour,
o'clock.
and it's a great point to stop on. Are you gonna be around this afternoon in case people wanna continue the conversation?
no, but I will be digitally around.
Please join me in thanking Valerie.